everybody. Welcome into a new episode of the Bengals Beat Podcast. I'm your host, Kelsey Conway, here at the Enquirer studio with podcast producer Phil Didion. And it has been a couple weeks when we've been trying to unload on what happened in the Bengals season and gear up for the off season, which can't believe we're already at the championship weekend. So there's a lot to talk about that's happened with these Bengals in the last couple of weeks. So it felt like a good time to hop back on the mic and give you the latest on what's been going on with these Cincinnati Bengals. So let's start with where things are after the Bengals season ended. Immediately following the Bengals season, after the team found out that they would not be entering the postseason, Zac Taylor made a number of staff changes in firing defensive coordinator Lou Anarumo and several coaches. He let go of defensive line coach Marion Hobby, linebackers coach James Betcher, and offensive line coach Frank Pollock. So a major staff shakeup for Taylor because for the last 6 years, he has made minimum changes here and there to his staff, but to let go of that many coaches is very telling in that Taylor wants to see change at specific areas on the offensive side of the ball, but mostly on defense. And that proved to be the Achilles heel of the Bengals season down the stretch, was the defense just wasn't good enough in a number of areas. And there are a lot of reasons why for that, but Taylor felt like change, new voices in certain positions was necessary, and that's where the Bengals are. They did, in fact, make a decision on who is going to be the new defensive coordinator, and that is Al Golden, a familiar name in Cincinnati. He was the linebackers coach for the Bengals from 2020 to 2021. Then moved to Notre Dame when Marcus Freeman got the job to be his defensive coordinator, just played in the college football national championship game against Ohio State, and within the last 48 hours has agreed to become the Bengals' new defensive coordinator. The team has yet to make it official as of, is it Thursday morning? Yes, I think it's Thursday. I don't even know what day of the week it is, but as of Thursday morning, it hasn't been official, but it is expected to be official at some point today. So that is the update on the Bengals. On the Cincinnati Enquirer, if you're interested to learn more about Al Golden, we have a couple of pieces for you, 5 things to know, just some historical references of what to expect from Golden in this defense, how we got to this position, and more. So be sure to check it out there. And we also have a special guest today on this episode, and that is Mike Golic Jr., who played football at Notre Dame, is one of the biggest Notre Dame fans I've ever met in my life, and he has watched every snap of Notre Dame football for the last several of years. So there was, in my opinion, no person better to bring on to talk about Al Golden, the impact he made on the Fighting Irish, and more than Mike. So be sure to keep this episode going to hear our conversation with Mike, who of course hosts his own show with his dad, Mike Golic Sr. And it's a show that I've been on a number of times, and it's a fun show. So be sure to check out Mike's show, of course. But you'll enjoy our conversation because we talk about the Al Golden factor and what to expect in Cincinnati. So just a little bit of a preview of that conversation, I wanted to talk about some things that really stand out. The Bengals have made a heavy investment on defensive players over the last couple of years, and they feel like those players need to play better, and the results speak for themselves, but they feel like Al Golden is the right guy to get those players to take the next step. And I'm talking about players like Cam Taylor-Britt, Myles Murphy, DJ Turner, Logan Wilson. Those guys have to play at a higher level next season for this team to be better. Because although, yes, the Bengals do enter the offseason with some cap space, they cannot go on a shopping spree and just replace every position on the defensive side of the ball. They are going to have to make some tough decisions and keep some of those players and just look at it. And that's what Zac Taylor and Duke Tobin are going to do for the next 2 months, is really zero in on where things went wrong. Is it a situation of we definitely need a new player at that position, or do we have a player that we feel like just didn't play well enough that with the right plan and the right leadership, he can play at a better level? And those are the tough decisions that they're going to have to make. I think that there's a couple of positions that 100% you should expect the Bengals to go out in free agency and get better at. And then there's also some positions where it's just kind of hard to tell what to make of. And I really bring all of this back to players like Cam Taylor-Britt. He entered this season with Pro Bowl aspirations, and he looked like a lock to get a second contract from the Bengals, and then went out and had a really rough year that included him getting benched a couple of times and just didn't play up to the level of that shut down cover corner that the Bengals needed. So he is a prime example of the conversations that Duke Tobin and Zach Taylor are probably going to be having is, do we need to go out and get another corner that can potentially start over Cam Taylor-Britt? Or do we think he can get there? We just got to make sure we have the right pieces and voices around him. They have to make that decision with several positions, but I think that on the defensive side of the ball, the one position that I expect them to address in free agency is the defensive tackle spot. They have got to get a veteran defensive tackle who can come in and be a difference maker on that interior of the defensive line. They have to get that right. They haven't gotten that position right for the last 2 years, and it's going to be expensive. They also need new guards. Those players aren't going to be that expensive, but if you want a really good guard, that money that you think that looks like a lot of money, it goes quick. And that also includes re-signing some of the players that are up for extensions or looking a year out and getting those deals done. So while it looks like the Bengals have a ton of cap space, I'm telling you that doesn't mean that you should be excited that they're going to go replacing all of these positions on the defensive side of the ball. They're going to have to make some tough choices. Which positions can we live with right now with what we have and hope that they get better? And where do we have to 100% go out and replace? And that is what we will be talking about for the next month as we gear up for free agency. So as of right now, the big news around the Bengals is the coaching changes. And we know that Al Golden will now be leading up the defensive group as the coordinator. The Bengals also made a hire this week in hiring offensive line coach Scott Peters. And this to me is an interesting decision from Zach Taylor, because when you look at where Peters has been, that's always what I go to for first. Where is the connection here, right? So for Taylor to make this decision on Scott Peters, you'd have to assume it was heavily influenced by the Callahans, and that's Bill and Brian Callahan, two of Taylor's closest confidants in the business. Peters coached under Callahan as an assistant offensive line coach in Cleveland for a number of years before going to New England to be the head offensive line coach there last season. That to me screams of Bill Callahan is widely known as one of the best offensive line coaches in the NFL. And so why would you not consult someone and go to Bill Callahan and say, I need to make a change on the offensive line. Who do you recommend? Also, there's the factor of Cleveland's offensive line has been very good for a long time. So bringing in someone who was able to get the most out of that offensive line, a lot of it is personnel for Cleveland, but I think that was a really smart decision by Zach Taylor. Instead of bringing in someone new who you don't really have someone to vouch for, they know someone who has worked with him daily for years in Bill Callahan. And also Taylor's gone up against this offensive line for years. So he knows what the scheme looks like, what are kind of the nuts and bolts that he's going to be about. And clearly it matches what Taylor wants to be in that position. So I think it was a really smart hire by Zach Taylor, and it makes a ton of sense when you go through why it happened. He will be tasked with helping get the Bengals, as I mentioned, they need new guards. The guard play was not good enough, and they've got a lot of questions to answer there because Alex Kappa's deal is up. Cordell Volson got benched halfway through the season. So really the only locks right now on the offensive line is Orlando Brown Jr. at left tackle, Marius Mims at right tackle, and Ted Karras, who will be entering the final year of his deal. So I think Scott Peters, the decision to bring him in now is really smart because they need better leadership when it comes to picking the right guards in free agency. And then what's the plan for after Ted Karras? That probably would not shock me if the Bengals address that in the draft at some point this year. So I think it was an important hire for Taylor to make now, so he has time to get to Cincinnati, get a pulse on the Bengals offense, because before you know it, it's going to be the combine, and then free agency is, just a few weeks after that. So a lot comes quickly in the NFL, and so for Taylor to get the Golden hire and the Peters hire done this week, I think is huge. They still have 2 positions left to hire in the linebackers coach role. They haven't made a decision there, and the defensive line coach position. So we will see where they land with that. But that is where we stand with the Bengals coaching news. As far as some player news, there was some news this morning, and that is the Bengals have 3 finalists for the AP Awards come Super Bowl weekend at the NFL Honors Show. And Joe Burrow has been named a finalist for the MVP along with 4 other players: Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson, Jared Goff, and Saquon Barkley. Burrow joins that group. It seems like a long shot for Burrow to win the MVP. It's probably going to go to Jackson or Allen, but the fact that he is a finalist is noteworthy because it's just another step showing just how terrific Burrow was this season. And so he should be rewarded for his play this season. And the 2 other Bengals that were named as finalists for these AP awards is Trey Hendrickson. He is up for Defensive Player of the Year, and Jamar Chase is up for Offensive Player of the Year, as well as Burrow, who is also up for the Comeback Player of the Year. So we will see. I think this is how it's going to shake out. I think that Trey Hendrickson will win Defensive Player of the Year. I think that Saquon Barkley will win Offensive Player of the Year. And I think that either Lamar Jackson or Josh Allen will win MVP, and Burrow will win Comeback Player of the Year. So I think that's how the votes are going to shake out, but it's still great that Trey Hendrickson, Jamar Chase, and Joe Burrow were rewarded from the 50 panelists that get to vote on this award for their amazing seasons, because they were outstanding and deserve all the credit in the world for their work this year. So we will stay tuned and see how all of those votes shake out. As I mentioned, these will come out the Saturday before Super Bowl at the NFL Honors Show in New Orleans. So keep it here for all of your coverage of that. So now let's get to our conversation with Mike Golic Jr. about Al Golden and what Bengals fans can expect with him coordinating the defense.
Well, our guest today is someone who is having a little bit of a tough week because his favorite team, where he went to college, where he played football at, lost the college football national championship game. And we'll get into why I wanted him to join us, but I wanted to start with, how are we feeling coming off of the loss to Ohio State?
Not great. I appreciate you having me here today. Maybe this can double as a bit of a therapy session.
Yes, but that's what we're here for.
Between losing the game, getting stuck overnight in Hartsfield Jackson, and now having to grapple with the reality that while I'm very excited to be here talking with you about what Al Golden can do for the Cincinnati Bengals as their defensive coordinator, that also means that my football team that I love and root for in college in Notre Dame now has to go out here and find and replace who has been one of the most successful coordinators in the sport over the last few years. So I have a lot of very big feelings right now going on, Kelsey. So I appreciate you letting me come here and work them out.
Well, thank you so much for joining me. You were the first and only person I wanted to have come on, because I think that there might not be someone who's watched more Notre Dame football over the last 2 years, and maybe you and your dad. And of course, you're super plugged in, and I'm sure at some point have met Al Golden, right? So I wanted to get your thoughts, and why I also wanted you on is I know, I've been on your show and you talk on your show daily about the NFL. So in addition to what Al Golden can do, you know enough about the Bengals that I was excited to have you on to talk about that too, with just the basics of what to expect from Al Golden. So he's not new to the Bengals linebackers coach during their Super Bowl run in 2021. And from anyone that I talk to inside the building, you don't hear anything but awesome things about the coach that Al Golden is, the teacher and the leader he is. So I think that they're really excited inside the building. But as someone who knows what he can do from a scheme standpoint and getting the best out of players, So why do you think Al Golden is going to make a good defensive coordinator for the Bengals?
Yeah, I think it's a couple of things that really stick out with Al. One is just his ability as a teacher to maximize whoever he's got on the field. The best coaches fit what they do to the personnel that they have. And certainly you can draft and sign free agents to an identity, but you got to be able to go out there and make the best of it. And Al Golden was sort of Aaron Glenn's college counterpart this year. Aaron Glenn, the Lions defensive coordinator, now Jets head coach, who had this group of injuries that kept hitting the team, and they refit their whole defensive identity around it. For Al Golden and Notre Dame, they went and were able to get so many different guys prepared to play this year in a year where they lost their best defensive lineman, their best cornerback, a bunch of other linebackers and guys and the defensive line group, that they had to constantly get young guys ready to go, and to have a coordinator that can effectively communicate what you're supposed to do, your role in the defense, and have you prepared to do that, I think is indicative of a pretty good coach from the outside looking in. And then I just also think too, they're a good fit schematically. You know, Al Golden, hey, maybe it won't be as much sticky man coverage across the board depending on who they've got with them in Cincinnati next year. But Al is a coordinator who is aggressive to his core. You watch Notre Dame football and you saw that was a fast, aggressive downhill group that wanted to go and try and force your quarterback to get the ball out of his hands quickly. And I think in a league where, and in a division, quite honestly, where, hey, you're dealing with incredible quarterbacks and you've got a great offense on the other side, you got a defense that's going to be able to go out and try and steal possessions, hold other team, present them problems on third down. And so schematically, they are aggressive. They throw a lot at you, and it was an NFL defense Notre Dame was running, but he's also a really effective communicator in being able to teach and get so many guys to buy in on what their role in that defense is.
There's so much here that I want to ask you about based off what you just said. But basically, the reason that the Bengals felt like they needed to move on from Lou Anarumo was a couple of things. But to them, the biggest thing is they've made a hefty investment on the defensive side of the ball draft-wise. They have drafted a number of defensive players over the last 2 or 3 years, preparing for the plan of having to pay a high-priced quarterback and a high-priced receiver. So they've drafted guys like Cam Taylor-Britt, DJ Turner, Joseph Osai, Miles Murphy, Logan Wilson. I mean, the list goes on and on about the guys that they've drafted, and yet the production for the last 2 seasons just hasn't been there. I think it's twofold. I think you could argue that the Bengals haven't necessarily drafted well enough on that side of the ball, but they also feel like they're not getting the max out of those players that they've invested in. And so that's why they felt like a new voice that could maybe connect with younger guys like an Al Golden would be better suited for that. I don't think that it's going to be that much schematically different than what the Bengals have been running previously, because here's the point that I don't think enough people are really talking about that I wanted your input on. Lou Anarumo was very aggressive in the way he called defenses too, and throwing a ton at quarterbacks so that they wouldn't know what was coming. And I know that style of defense takes really high IQ players to be able to execute. Like it worked when they had Jesse Bates, DJ Reader, Larry Ogunjobi, guys that have been in the league for a while, that it maybe necessarily didn't work for some of the younger guys. But the Bengals are in win now mode. Like they don't necessarily have time to start from ground zero. Of course, they're going to install new things in the offseason and camp. But I think a big reason why someone told me this, and I thought it was interesting, a lot of the language and verbiage can stay the same because Al Golden was here under some of the things that really worked in Lou Anarumo's defense. So what do you think are going to be the main differences between the Lou Anarumo style defense for the Bengals and the Al Golden style defense of the Bengals?
Well, to your point, thankfully, there is a lot of familiarity and connective tissue around there. So hopefully it's not a ton for the players other than the way things are taught and communicated and what they focus on in terms of development. Because to your point, the Bengals have had a development problem. And that's why I went back to, that was the first thing that stood out to me about Al Golden is, you watch the position that he coached in Cincinnati at linebackers. I would argue that's the position group that got the best, most improved from start of the season to the end of the season for Notre Dame, with a lot of different guys playing there. He was able to get that group, into their responsibilities and playing their best football by year's end. And so I think that development for, you think about all the guys they've drafted along the defensive line here. Obviously, Trey Hendrickson's your bell cow there, but, Miles Murphy is a first-round pick a year ago, hasn't shown as much so far. Chris Jenkins and McKinley Jackson, all these guys in that area to go along with the linebackers, that was a position group that got hit hard by injury in South Bend this fall, was the D-line as well. And so I just think, again, being able to develop and connect with young players, like you said, and to bring them along speaking a language they already know can go a long way into trying to make the most out of what you've got there. This isn't college where you can overhaul it in the portal in an offseason if you really don't like your roster. And so he's got to be able to come in there and try and connect with and get the most out of this group. And I think he has displayed an ability to do that at a really high level.
That's really interesting because, in my opinion, in addition to the defensive line, the worst position for the Bengals last year was their linebacker spot. From where they were in 2021 when Logan Wilson was playing great and got that extension, I feel like Jermaine Pratt got slower and just didn't have the same type of production from a shared tackling standpoint. Like, they need to get back to better play at the linebacker position. And so I think that's huge that Al Golden, that's kind of his bread and butter. But I think what you're mentioning about the defensive front, the Bengals cannot afford to go out on this massive shopping spree on the defensive line and overhaul the whole thing. And I know that's not what fans want to hear, but they can't afford for McKinley Jackson and Chris Jenkins and Miles Murphy to be zero factors out there. Someone has got to be able to help Miles Murphy have a better season. I mean, 0 sacks from your first round pick is just not a world that anybody can afford to live in. So I think that Al Golden being the right person that they hope can do that, it is encouraging for Bengals fans to want to hear. Why do you think for him, he wanted to make the jump back to the NFL, considering most of his time has been spent at college?
Yeah, I think, without knowing and hearing this from Al personally, my guesses are generally what they always are is, hey, the NFL is always going to have a certain amount of appeal to guys that have been there or competitors because it is the highest level of football. It presents the greatest opportunity to go and test yourselves against the other best players and coaches in the world. And so for some people, that's always going to be seen as the mountaintop because, quite honestly, with Al, he must also believe that, hey, Cincinnati's on the cusp of something, and if they can get the defense right, you saw what Joe and the offense are capable of because he's leaving behind a team in South Bend that's going to be damn good next year. That defense that he helped mold is going to bring back a ton of freshmen and sophomore starters, a ton of talented guys, and have a chance to be a great team again next year. And so I think it's got to be twofold. It's, hey, for Al, hey, having the familiarity with Cincinnati and not being too far from, I think he's got a son who's a freshman at Notre Dame already now, family in the area. And so to be geographically close, to know the organization and the coaching staff, and to believe that, hey, in a league where a quarterback like Joe is going to give you a chance every year, if we can get this defense right, we really might have an opportunity here. I think would all be reasons why Al Golden could look at Cincinnati and say, all right, this makes sense for me to make a jump from a very good college gig to a great opportunity for me in professional football back at a place I know.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. I just have a couple more for you. Tell me some Notre Dame players that are going to be draft prospects that could be fits for the Bengals, knowing how Al Golden helped them along.
Yeah, well, I think going into this year or going into this draft cycle here, the two biggest names for Notre Dame or people looking in the draft at Notre Dame are going to be their defensive backs, I think, in Xavier Watts, their star safety, two-time All-American. Last year, I think, was the Nagurski Award winner and one of the best ball hawks in college football over the last number of seasons. I think finished up with 13 interceptions in the last 2 years. And then Benjamin Morrison's going to be their first rounder. Incredible cornerback. For my money, when he was healthy last season, because he dealt with, I think it was a hip injury this year that ended his season early, and you could tell was a little step slower this year, and I think he tried to play through that injury and just couldn't. But when he was healthiest, he was the best cover corner I've seen play for Notre Dame football in my lifetime.
Wow.
Al Golden and what, Mike Mickens, their defensive back coach, had done, Marcus Freeman with his defensive background, coming over in the last 3 years. Notre Dame in my lifetime would not a team that could strap up and play man coverage with people. That just wasn't what we had done. Julian Love, who's playing safety for the Seahawks now, was the best corner at Notre Dame in recent memory before that. And he was still a guy that was, smart, played off coverage, a little more zone. Ben got into town, and Notre Dame played Ohio State 2 years ago in the regular season. Marvin Harrison Jr. is in that game, and they put him over there on an island and said, you got it. And for the most part, he was able to handle that and pretty much everything else that went his way. And so I think both of those guys in a year where Notre Dame might be a little bit lighter on some draft prospects. Again, so many of their guys were so young. Jeremiah Love, their running back, is going to be a guy that talent-wise can flirt with first-round ability when he comes back next year for his junior season. Whole bunch of offensive linemen are going to be up in that. Some of the defensive guys as well in the linebacker and D-line level. But I think for anyone scouting Notre Dame this year, it's oddly enough about the defensive secondary, this area that's probably seen as much change in Al Golden and Marcus Freeman's time in South Bend as any group in football.
Well, corner and safety are both needs for the Bengals, so that'll be interesting to follow. I'm sorry I hit you with a draft question in January. I didn't mean to do that, but that's just where my brain went.
It's so good. I saw Mel Kiper Jr. put out his first 2025 mock draft, and that hit me in a way I wasn't ready for. I love mock drafts. It's already fun to think about that. And for everyone now, I mean, coming off the extended college football season, Senior Bowl's right around the corner. The Combine's going to be here before we know it. So it is never too early to talk draft season.
Yes. Well, I'm with you. Like I couldn't click. I said I wasn't going to look at mocks until after free agency. And here I am just clicking away. So I'm excited to look into those two guys that you said, because those two positions are definitely of need for the Bengals. So I want to close it with this. If there's a game that Bengals fans that, are really into this, that want to go watch, that you think was maybe Al Golden's best game in terms of game plan or the way that the defense played, what would you say that game was?
All right, let me pull up the schedule here and see what we're looking at. Because honestly, the nice part about this season is there were a lot to choose from when it came to the job that Al did. I mean, I would certainly say the playoff run, against Cincinnati in round one, really gave them no breathing room. Against Penn State, I thought that game, if you want to look at Al Golden too, the Penn State game adjustment from second half to first, where Notre Dame going into the Penn State game had come off a stretch where they had played and beat Georgia in the Sugar Bowl in a game that was delayed a day because of the unfortunate tragedy that happened in New Orleans on New Year's Eve day in the early hours of the morning. And so that game got pushed back, which meant they had a tighter turnaround going into the Penn State game. They had guys dealing with the flu on that team. They had lost their best defensive lineman to an injury in the game before that. So they were beat up, they were down, and they were getting rolled off the ball by Penn State in the first half of that game. And the second half starts, and that group starts to bare its teeth again. You have plenty of the young guys that have stepped up that made plays in that game. So I think anything in the playoff stretch could be a good one, but I think that one especially because of how that game started, where it looked like they might be running out of gas, to how that game finished in the second half, where, Christian Gray is a player that's not draft eligible, and he's not Benjamin Morrison, who I just talked about by any stretch. But he's a guy that got picked on a bit at the end of the season. They play a ton of man coverage against USC. He had a tough game against Ohio State recently. He had a tough game, but at the end of that game, again, just the confidence that Al Golden has imbued in the players on that team. Christian Gray, in the waning moments of that game, Drew Aller drops back to try and go and pass in a drive, maybe at a spot that's ill-advised. And Dan Orlovsky did a great breakdown of how prepared everyone on Notre Dame's defense was for that particular play, including Christian, who gets the game-sealing interception that gives Notre Dame a chance to go down there and end it. So I just think it's so many big moments this season, that one in particular. Al had this group mentally prepared as well as physically prepared, even when it seemed like the war of attrition was getting won by the other side.
Great. Well, I saw that breakdown from Dan, and I remember that game, so I'm definitely going to go take a look back at that. I lied because I said that was my last question, but I did remember this is the one question I did want to ask you. If there's one player that you think could make the biggest jump for the Bengals under Al Golden, who would you think it is?
By the way, in the one game answer too, I want to make an addendum to that because I just remembered it from last year. Go watch the Notre Dame USC game from 2023 where they undressed Caleb Williams and ruined the rest of USC's season. It was at home in South Bend. That was the defensive masterpiece from Al Golden. That's the one where if you want to get real like hot and bothered and like sweaty, maybe don't watch that one around company. That's the game to turn on there. As far as a player, I do think you mentioned the linebacker level. I think that group for Cincinnati, just because he's already got familiarity with them as players, I'm sure. And that group, again, just improved so much for Notre Dame over the course of this last season. You know, they had one veteran player there in Jack Kaiser, who had been at Notre Dame for 6 years, I think played in more games than anyone in Notre Dame history. But besides that, it was young guys. It was guys that hadn't played a ton in the years leading up to it. And from the Northern Illinois game they lost to the end of the season, I just loved watching those guys play football. And so, you know, that linebacker group overall for Cincinnati, I think is really in for a treat in having him back around the Queen City.
Awesome. Well, you gave me so much to look forward to. Draft prospects. I've got some film homework to do. So always just such great stuff from you. So thank you so much for joining me. And hopefully I'll talk to you soon. I have a feeling it's going to be a very busy Bengals offseason. So I think we'll be chatting soon.
Absolutely. I am happy to chat anywhere, anytime, as long as it's not at Hartsfield-Jackson Airport in Atlanta.
We can make that happen. All right. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Kelsey.
Thanks so much for tuning in to this episode of the Bengals Beat Podcast. Be sure to keep it here throughout the offseason as we bring you all your coverage of the Cincinnati Bengals.